Right. I promised you that every one of these sessions was going to have premier speakers. And this next one, examining the state of Ukraine's military industrial capacity amidst war, is no different than all the other sessions we've had. We have a moderator, Dr. Steve Blank. We've got Major General Volodymyr Avreliev, who until recently had been First Deputy Minister of Defense. We have Dr. Philip Carber, and I just, for myself, want to personally say that he and Wes Clark, General Clark, were the guys who sounded the alarm back 10 years ago, and so I'm just delighted to have him here. And then one of the finest journalists I know, you can keep reading him in Breaking Defense, and that's Reuben Johnson. So, Steve,
okay,
it's all yours.
Thank you, Walter. I have the real honor and pleasure of presenting this panel on Ukrainian defense industry. The three gentlemen who are going to be speaking here are at the top of the list of experts in this field who know better than most people where the bodies are buried, if I may use that phrase.
That's not a good word.
Well, I went to school in Chicago, so yeah, grew up in Brooklyn, so you know, right. So okay. First of all, on my right, and we're going to speak in alphabetical order, is Major Volodymyr Avreliev, who is Major General, retired. He's currently director of the Veterans Dozen Foundation. Immediately prior to his current appointment, he was the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine. And then earlier than that, he was Defense Attaché, at the Ukrainian Embassy here in the United States, which is where I met him from 2015 to 18, and he spoke often at these conferences back then. He started his career in the military in air defense units in 1981. And then in 1991, he joined the newly emerged Ukrainian Armed Forces and was one of the first group of military attachés, and has since had tours to the US, the UK, and Romania. He was the commandant as well of the Military Diplomatic Academy in Kiev, and he's also participated in peacekeeping operations in the Balkans in 1998 as part of the aftermath of the disintegration of Yugoslavia, and then the anti-terrorist operation against Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine in 2015. On my immediate left, Reuben Johnson is a 37-year veteran of analyzing and reporting on foreign and U.S. military technology and defense industrial developments and Russian defense policy. I can give you an example. In 2006, I came across an article that he probably forgot already, where he said that back then the Russians were training military forces to enter into Crimea, Moldova, and a couple of other places, and were based at Solnitsyn-Godorsk. I quoted it. Nobody ever took me up on the fact, or Reuben, on the fact that, you know, these operations go back in planning at least almost 20 years now. But he has spent more than 3 decades working inside of U.S. industry and analyzing on-site numerous foreign defense facilities, including locations in Russia, Ukraine, and the PRC, Poland, Belarus, Australia, France, Spain, Brazil, and Sweden. He's consulted on defense industrial developments for the United States and several NATO governments. He has also a more than 30-year history of publications in defense and foreign affairs in the US, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He's won multiple awards for reporting on the current war between Ukraine and Russia, and resided in Kiev for more than 20 years until he was forced to evacuate in the face of the Russian invasion 2 years ago. Finally, further on the left, Philip Carber, who I think all of you know, is president of the Potomac Foundation, professor of strategy and praxis at Georgetown University's Machiavelli Seminar in Florence. Not a bad gig, Phil. He also had postdoc certificates from Harvard and Wharton Business Schools. In government, Dr. Carber has held influential national security policies with the U.S. Congress, the NSC, and was a member of the U.S. Army Science Board, served as strategy advisory to the Secretary of Defense and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Toward the end of the Cold War, he was an advisor to Prime Minister Thatcher and the Secretary General of NATO. And in the spring of 2014, he and General Wesley Clark were invited by the new Ukrainian government to assess the situation there. They've made numerous trips to Ukraine and written major reports to Congress, which were among the first to argue for U.S. military assistance and lethal weapons. So with a panel like this, you don't need to hear from me. General?
So we are going to talk about the industry, defense industry, and it's about sustainment. Any war is about sustainment, how long you can survive, given the resources you have, given the production capability, and given the support from outside. So we, after 2 years in Ukraine, fully understand what is all about sustainment. The war started in 22 with very limited defense industry capability of Ukraine. Of course, we've done a lot from the first Russian war in 2014, but nevertheless, we didn't have production of ammunition at all. We were concentrated a lot on export of legacy equipment. We have limited missile program, which we started after 2014. We didn't have new equipment. So it was a real challenge when the war started. In 2 months, we understood that our current stocks of ammunition will be empty very soon. And that's why we started to communicate with partners on switching to the NATO standards in artillery. It's 155, 105, 120 caliber. And fortunately, we started to receive them in May 22 from the United States. First 777 artillery came to us, and then ammunition, then HIMARS, and step by step, we are there where we are. I think by the end of the war, most of our equipment will be of foreign origin, especially in artillery. At the same time, we started a lot of programs inside Ukraine, especially related to artillery, ammunition, high technology things related to EW, jamming, communication, command and control. And we didn't have any support at the beginning. First 3, 4, 5 months, we were just survive on what we had. The industry, defense industry, Ukraine, it has very interesting story. In 2014, all enterprises were state-owned. And we learned that the state-owned enterprises, they are not effective. They are slow, they are bureaucratic, they are not have no initiative. That's why many private projects emerged in 2015, 16. But when the invasion started, most of the new production of sophisticated production started to come from private industry. It's an interesting phenomenon. At the same time, most of the state-owned industry were targeted by Russians at the beginning of the war because their coordinates were well known. They were published in many catalogs of the exhibitions. And so the Russians, they didn't have any problems to target the first wave of missiles and aviation, trying to destroy key state-owned enterprises, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine. That's why they suffered first, but Russians, they didn't have any clue about what is going on with private sector. So all private sector survived and started to blossom after the war started because resources emerged from the government. A lot of orders came, and only the initiative and energy of the private sector gave us a lot of successes, especially in the area of drones, EW, interceptions, jamming, and communication, because we didn't have other sources to supply that kind of equipment. Now, around 60–70% of procurement for Ministry of Defense comes from private sector. They're still state-owned enterprises, but they are mostly concentrated on repair and maintenance of the current fleet of legacy equipment, and also they are just doing their best to repair and maintain the equipment we received from our partners last 2 years. The key challenges in this area, of course, is about security, number one, because every day, every 2–3 days, we have a waves of Shahid-type drones coming to Ukraine. once a week or once in 2 weeks, we have missile attacks against the key infrastructure in industry this year. Most of the last launches from Russia, they're targeting areas of industry, first of all, because they understand that Ukraine has a strong backup from their own industry, first of all. We moved a lot of enterprises and production from the east to other secure places. We dispersed many technological lines. So we adjusted ourselves to the current security situation. So we have very robust, stable industry in Ukraine now. But of course, it's not enough to satisfy the needs of our military. They are more okay on the maintenance and repair of the legacy. They are more okay on the drones. Most of the drones we buy the Ukrainian origin. We started with the 2-3 companies who could do that. And now we have almost 200 small enterprises, up to 200 small enterprises who are involved in drone industry. Some of them can produce FPV drones, some of them something bigger, but altogether it's a very powerful industry which is capable to satisfy the real needs of our military. They only depend maybe on some components, and because it's also part of the supply chain and the world problem, you know, with the chips and other things is there. But in terms of the design, ideas, software, they are very vibrant. There's a competition among them, and every 2 or 3 weeks we have something change in design because they have feedback from the field on lessons learned with the equipment, and they introduce some new solutions. And Ukrainian drones in the field are very effective now. That's important. It's a result of the competition, adrenaline in the companies. Most of the companies, new companies in defense sector, they moved from the civil sector. So before the war, they were involved in agriculture or just energy or something else. But they acquired a lot of experience and technological knowledge before the war in their sector. And with that knowledge and experience, they moved to the defense, and they started to create things which maybe a regular classic defense industry is not capable to do, but because they think differently. And there were a lot of young people who can think very creatively about that. The key issue for us now is, of course, to get direct communication with our partners on defense industrial cooperation. It means cooperation between the United States companies and our companies on supporting production of critical material in Ukraine. And also it's about transfer of technology to us. It means we expect that, and there are many efforts done by both sides, and we expect that there will be a more easy way for US companies to come to Ukraine because it's now limited by the law here. US companies can't present in US physically. At the same time, we should expect that the procedures of licensing and permissions in the US will be much more flexible in respect to Ukraine. So we have good communication in this regard. Today I had a conversation in DoD on this part, and they are very energetic with that. So it's a very dynamic area, but it still requires a lot of efforts by all sides to make it decisive in this war. Thank you.
Ruben? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to start. Oh, it was there. There it is. Okay. All right. I'm going to go through this quickly. Now, I put this up here. This is not representative of what happens in Ukraine, but General Hodges can say whether that's the ideal of how a defense community should work, how all these different pieces, how all these different pieces should feed together. Unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't have a lot of this because there was no institutional basis for it, but this is kind of the ideal. This is what you want to get to. The industry at the moment has a lot of challenges. because there's so much, and Phil is going to talk about this in detail, so I'm not going to go into it now, but there's an awful lot, as the general has said, there's an awful lot of foreign-owned hardware, multiple lines for spare parts and servicing. And the repair requirements are probably exceed anything that's ever been seen in modern times. At the same time, most of this is done by the very capable private companies, is integrating foreign weapon systems onto existing platforms in Ukraine. There's been a lot of different Western US-made missiles integrated onto Ukrainian platforms. And then there are some indigenous projects in Ukraine that actually succeeded in spite of the government, not because of it. And one particular, the Neptune anti-ship missile, this is what sunk the Moskva guided missile cruiser about 2 months after the invasion. So the task right now of modernizing Ukrainian industry, and lots of people want to try and help, but upgrading older Soviet era platforms is step number one, to use those now until they can be replaced by something else. There's a lot of talk. I hear a lot of talk, and the words interim solutions are written in inverted commas. But then generally reconfiguring everything to NATO standards, developing supplier networks, all of the things you're going to have to do, because in this world, everything is connected to everything else. The defense industry has become like the auto industry. Everything is spread out around the world, although we've had to rethink a lot of that after COVID. And then new Ukrainian indigenous design programs. Ukraine is not just going to become a job shop for the rest of the world. They're going to have their own systems that they're going to use that are going to be highly effective. But the industry itself is probably the most, I think it's going to be the locomotive of modernization for the entire defense establishment. And I just want to say a few words about how a lot of people don't recognize this, but Ukraine industry existed in the beginning based on the old Soviet model. So in the Soviet Union, industries that belong to, or enterprises that belong to one of the defense industrial ministries, made new weapon systems, and they were largely located in Russia. And then there was a parallel universe of repair and overhaul facilities. Those belonged to the MOD. Ukraine inherited that arrangement in some ways. In some countries, those two functions were merged, but there's still a degree of separation there. But both have a lot to contribute in their own ways. And some of the Ukrainian overhaul plants or repair plants have more experience with those specific platforms than the OEMs themselves. Then you've got major manufacturers of systems in Ukraine, like we all know about Motor Sich, which we tried to keep the Chinese from buying, Luch and some of the others. Some very, very innovative and successful defense electronics people. And these are the people that'll make the difference in this wartime environment. These are the people coming up with some of the innovations and modifications that are breathing new life into some old pieces of kit. And as I said just now about the parallel universe of overhaul facilities, there's a lot of major subsystem suppliers. Testimony to that was when the Chinese began to buy a lot of systems from Russia in the early 90s. They bought Su-27 fighter aircraft and submarines and other things, but they always came to Ukraine for the stuff that goes inside of it. And that's particularly true when they started making their own reverse engineered illegal copies of things. They still went to Ukraine to use the original radar, the original whatever they could buy. However, as the general sort of alluded to, by the time we get to the war, there's not a lot of Ukraine defense industry that's building things for the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military hadn't been spending a lot of money, particularly in the 1990s. So the industries were all geared towards export markets. And one of the consequences of that is that I used to ask Ukrainian companies, I said, well, do your own armed forces ever buy anything from you? And they say, well, our armed forces, they're kind of like orphanages. We have to give them stuff for free. And anytime they see something new, they want a free copy. And I was at one of the expos and one of the leading Ukrainian companies, and here's the delegation coming to all the guys with the hats and the braid and everything. And the director said, quick, he says, hide the brochures and the models of anything new, because I don't want to give any more stuff away. So okay, so since we're in wartime now, what I call adaptive measures means that in order to survive, in order to keep repairing all the stuff that's broken, and in order to keep absorbing new kit, and in order to maintain op-tempo, all these other things, we're going to have to do all of this stuff here. And I don't want to read everything because I don't want to run out of time. But what it comes down to is partnerships with foreign industry are going to be important, but what's even going to be even more important is contracting out functions to the private sector and trying to find ways to leverage. I mean, what the Chinese call civil military integration is going to have to happen. And it's going to have to happen fast. And the export licensing process on both sides. I mean, the U.S. side I know is a nightmare, but it's been a nightmare on the Ukrainian side as well. So there's going to have to be a lot of work done to streamline all of the paperwork procedures. And at the end of this all, as I keep saying for everybody, the model for Ukraine in the future is basically Israel, where you have a country that's geared up, ready to fight, and the industrial base is very robust and tries to depend as little as possible on the outside world. I'm not gonna go through all this because it's gonna take too long, but I show this chart to a lot of people. You know, I used to work for a defense contractor, and you know, defense contractors are evil because they make things that cost so much money. But you start looking at what constitutes the total ownership cost, and you see that the actual manufacturer is not the major contributor to that, what we call total ownership cost. There's all kinds of things that happen after you buy the weapon system. All of that's going to have to be recreated in Ukraine because the infrastructure for a lot of things set up to support Soviet-style weapons is not set up to support something like an F-16. And then this is just my last comment. Ukraine being in a war with an existential threat, they do not have to worry about why they're buying weapons, why they're acquiring weapons. It's to win the war, it's to kill Russians. But as I say, if you look at these major procurements here, these were all made based on completely different types of considerations. You know, Poland wanted F-16s because they said, oh, if there's ever a war, F-16s are the countries that are going to be coming from other places to our country. So we want those. And Brazil wanted a company that would breathe a lot of life into Embraer and so on. But this is a way that defense industrial politics are very strange, and they move from country to country. In Ukraine, it's going to have only one function. It's how to be stronger, better, faster than the Russians and to eventually expel them from the country.
Thank you. Phil?
Great. They had the stage set between the general and I sort of took a broader definition of this panel. It was instead of military industrial capacity, I'm going to call it sustainment capacity, because it isn't just the industry. There's other aspects to it that I'd like to at least mention. One that tends to be neglected is manpower. So the Ukrainians went to war with their active force. They've doubled the number of brigades. Of the force that was there on February 24th, 2022, only 20% of those officers and troops are left. They've been replaced by reservists who are mobilized. Now many of those units are significantly depleted. Ukraine started the war with one territorial brigade. They created, I believe, 31. These were originally to be in regional defense. In fact, as almost a basis for insurgency or local protection. but because of the needs for manpower, and these were based on volunteers, local volunteers, most of whom had no military experience. And in these territorial brigades, they did not have the training assets. Some of them didn't have concerns, let alone or weapons, but they've been and essentially been turned into light infantry. And with the losses at the front now, they've been thrown into the breach. But they don't have combined arms experience. They don't have radios. So it's they call themselves meat. Ukraine has a manpower problem. They do not mobilize young people. So they have not had a national draft. Even the reservists who are called up are limited to age 26. I think they're going to drop that to age 25. This is not sustainable. They're going to have to call a national draft. You go on a Friday or Saturday night into a bar or a disco, and it's full of young men who in our countries would be serving in a similar situation. I understand it's politically extremely sensitive. As you know, males are not allowed to leave the country, and a lot of those people are not going to be happy about being drafted. But it's something's going to have to happen there. Let's turn to the second problem that tends not to get much attention, and that's maintenance. So 3 years ago, last time when Ben and I were there together, the standard was what? Well, Ukraine needs to get standardized with NATO. Okay. Well, I'm here to tell you that they are today. Ukraine has more NATO equipment than any other country in the world. I'm just going to, and it's easy to say that, but try to maintain that. So, for example, there's 5 NATO tanks that have been sent to Ukraine. Each one has its own spare parts, own equipment needs, own optics. 20 different armored vehicles, armored fighting vehicles or infantry fighting vehicles. 28 light Humvee type, 28. And SAMs, 7 different SAM systems. And artillery, 12 different self-propelled. I'm not counting the towed, just 12 different self-propelled. And the reason I emphasize self-propelled is because while they're extremely useful in the battlefield in terms of mobility, survivability, they are extremely much more complex to maintain than is a towed system. So there's 12 different, and the good news is they're basically standardized on 155 millimeter ammunition. The bad news is that that's been depleted. I was talking to, we just got back from the last 2 months in and out of Ukraine. I was talking to a brigade commander. He goes, last summer, we were killing 10 Russians for every guy we were losing, my brigade. For example, I had a 30-man platoon, and where we were taking those out. So at the end of a month, basically, we had killed 300 Russians, but the equivalent of my platoon would be gone. Well, come fall, when the U.S. supply chain got thinned out because of Gaza and Middle East, no Ukrainian or no commander in the world is going to just use up all his artillery until he doesn't, ammunition until he doesn't have any. So they said, okay, we're going to go to half usage. So now we're only going, instead of killing 10 Russians, we're only going to be killing 5 for ammunition. When the Congress stopped the indecision on the Sidiophobia on aid to Ukraine, they had to cut it in half again. It's not now, and you can look at the results. It's already been mentioned to Divka and so forth. To give you how crazy it is, of the artillery systems that we in the West sent, they're only being used at 20% capacity for lack of ammunition. It's nuts. Now, in terms of the maintenance issue, the United States was pretty good about sending maintenance packages and supplies and repair systems, and so forth, and even training up the Ukrainians to use our systems. But a lot of NATO countries sent stuff, but it's just sent the weapon without any support. for example, the American produced but held in many NATO countries, the M109 155 howitzer. Great system, self-propelled. 300 of those systems arrived in Ukraine. Only half of them are being used because the other half didn't arrive with enough spare parts. So the barrels are being taken from those when and in exchange when they get burned out, and likewise with engines and so forth. It's crazy. It's crazy. Last week, the Russians had a new total. They fired 80,000 rounds of ammunition in one day of artillery. 80,000. And just look at the press at how much even we are talking about sending, even if we pass the aid package. The artillery differential between the Ukrainians and the Russians is 6.5 to 1. There's also the supply issue. So it's a serious maintenance issue. And the question is, who does that? The supply issue is not just for artillery or the armored vehicle or vehicles with motive power. For example, half of the manpad systems in Ukraine now are Western, at least 5 different types. So you have a system and you need to replace it. You need to be able to maintain it. Of the anti-tank guided missiles, half of the anti-tank guided missile systems in Ukraine are now Western in terms of types, and you can do mortars and so forth. So it's Ukraine industry and Ruben has been eloquent and describe and the general in describing the change from state-owned entity. And I was certainly one of the critics of Ukraine boron prom. I call it Ukraine boron porn.
I like that.
And the reason I did it is because their mission statement had 3 major missions. One, take Soviet era products, modernize them a little bit, and sell them to the third world to make money. Third, to pay taxes. In 2017, they paid more taxes to the government of Ukraine than the military in Ukraine bought from the Ukrainian that defense industry. The whole idea was to essentially a cash cow to provide the government money, and also to keep the 100,000 employees employed. So the military were at the fourth and last priority. That's not true now. They're trying to change it. They have a new director who's extremely qualified, unlike the previous ones who were primarily political appointees. And they're a fraction of their former size. But they remain really important because they're doing all that maintenance on all those different systems. That's not done by a group of entrepreneurs in somebody's garage. Likewise, when Western countries want to have a strategic alliance with the Ukrainian industry, they will not generally come into a country and sign up an agreement with some small little 20-man, 30-man firm. So the good news is that 5 countries in NATO have created a, quote, a strategic industrial alliance with Ukraine: Canada, Denmark, Germany, France, and Britain. And who are they doing it with? They're doing it with the remnants of Ukraine. So there is a function in that state industry, and we can all criticize it, and it's bureaucratic and Soviet era and so forth. And it was at one point supplying 40% of these components to the Russian army. Nonetheless, it ends up having a critical role. It's not going to disappear and should not disappear, at least probably while this war is going on. The Russians have been targeting the plants. The general is correct that most of the targeting has been against the Ukraine facilities, but nonetheless, they've also now recently started targeting the larger entrepreneurial units. Mention was made of the success of the Ukraine Neptune missile. A few weeks ago, the Russians targeted that plant. The engineers did not leave when the air raid sounded, and 20 of them were killed. The Russians are systematically trying to wipe out Ukrainian defense industry. A lot has been talked about innovation, and I'm a big fan of it. And certainly a lot of these smaller units have entrepreneurial spirit, and they are trying to link up with Western supply. One of the issues, and drones are the issue of the day, and everybody's building drones. The one area that tends to be neglected is counter drone technology. And it's natural to turn to electronic warfare to try and break or suppress the control of the drones. But as drones become more autonomous in their control and even targeting, that's getting harder, not easier. Almost every drone that's used, at least over the battlefield, it depends on an optical train. It has a camera looking down. General Kubelenko's DARPA unit is one of the few that was doing some work, at least with lasers as counter optical train work. And in an area that is exciting and has great potential is to be able to think of using those lasers instead of vertically against snipers or against anti-tank missile launchers, vertically to burn out the optical trains. And that's an area of significant innovation. But there's problems. And one of the big problems is us. So a major US company wants to go over and talk to them. We can borrow, steal, buy Ukrainian technology, but in terms of transferring ours to them is an absolute, as Ruben said, a nightmare in terms of bureaucracy and ITAR. I'll give two positive examples recently I haven't to know about personally. So Ukrainians had developed, so in this modern combat with protective systems, the good news is that soldiers are surviving injuries more, but they're taking greater proportion of injuries to their limbs. And with modern submunitions, and particularly high velocity bullets, when it hits a bone, it shatters the bone, and you tend to lose that arm and leg. Ukraine right now has about 90,000 so seriously wounded that they cannot return. They will not be functional either for the military or the society, as the senator alluded to. So that's a serious need. So there were some Ukrainians who developed a concept of using 3D printing to do replacement bones. They've now linked up with Sinai Hospital here, and a whole series. The project is called Adam. You can look it up on YouTube, see some really cool videos. They're now going to be doing that bone replacement for shattered bones in a hospital in Eastern Poland. Thank you. And my last point is one of the areas another area that Ukraine is starting at the cabinet level is a program called MITS, Military Innovation Technology Solutions. And the idea is, because you have these little entrepreneurial things, usually they're scientists or engineers. They don't know how to run a company. They haven't been to business school or so forth. So the idea is to put together Western teams to mentor them and so to help them not only in terms of their own business, but also in linking up with Western partners. And I think that's going to be a very exciting initiative. So in conclusion, I don't mean to be negative. I'm very positive in terms of Ukrainian technology. It's been its potential, and as both the general and Ruben has said, but there are some very real challenges. And I don't think it behooves us to minimize those or ignore them. If I had a bottom line, I would say that Ukraine has great potential, but right now, no strategy in terms of incorporating and further developing its defense industry. And that needs to be worked on. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Let me just make 2 points as chairman. One, piggybacking on what Phil has just concluded with, we heard earlier today that we don't have a strategy either for defense. And I mean, I can tell you this, the example I quoted earlier today, a couple of people in the audience were there also, with the J4 said, he didn't even know what the Lend-Lease program had been doing. Or he didn't even mention that he didn't even know it was no longer legal. It was no longer on the books. So it's very clear that apart from the political struggle, there is no strategy in the United States. And if there's no strategy, you lose, regardless of everything else. I've talked about this with General Hodges in the past and so forth. Second, when 10 years ago, when they had when the Russians annexed Crimea, we had a demonstration right here in Lafayette Park. Walter remembers, I was there. At the time, I quoted Nelson's famous remark at Trafalgar. I mean, he already knew he's dying, he was mortally wounded, but they tell him they've won. And he said that England has saved herself by her example, by her exertions in Europe, by her example. Ukraine has the potential to save itself by its exertions, provided we give it the means, or as Churchill said, give us the tools and we'll do the job. But if the West is still unable to get its act together, those exertions will not have an exemplary, to paraphrase Nelson, effect on the rest of Europe and the West, or the world. Because as Prime Minister Meloni has said in Italy, Hamas's attack on October 7th would not have been possible without the Russians invading Ukraine. That's a signal to all the bad actors. You can talk about North Korea, Iran, China, and so forth. The Chinese trying to push around Philippines, North Korea's nuclear program, Iran's use of proxies, and the Russians are also involved in this. They're supporting the Houthis in the Red Sea. So it is urgent, and I don't use that word lightly. It is urgent that the United States not only have a strategy for helping Ukraine, but that it work with Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine wins and that there's a strategy in place for the post-war Europe so we don't lose that piece as well for the third time after World War I, after the end of the Cold War. We had one in place that came about at the end of World War II. It was difficult to bring into effect, and there were a lot of detours and so forth, but it worked. It held the peace for 70 years, but we could lose it all again. So defense industry is critical, as Phil said, and as my colleagues have said. There's a lot of interesting, original, positive things happening in Ukrainian defense sector, but it needs a strategy and a vision and people to make those visions work.
And Phil, you reminded us that what so many people are clamoring for, all this equipment that's sitting somewhere, just give it to the Ukrainians. Not one of them will work. Every single one of the hundreds of Bradleys and tanks and all the other stuff, it will need thousands of dollars of work in order to be functional. So I think we should be careful about pressing for more of that until we've addressed the maintenance and the sustainability of what's already there. And of course, adding more shooters without adding ammunition may not be helpful either. My question is about procedures. Is there anything for each of you, if Secretary Austin were here or Senator Duckworth, if she was back here, if there's like one thing that we could fix in the US or in Ukraine that would make these things easier? I'm not talking about political decisions about let's provide, but is there a procedural thing that makes this harder than it should be to move quickly on? Assume a political decision has been made.
Do you mind taking that to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll give you three. One is have a selective change in the ITAR for Ukraine, recognizing that they are an ally and they're in dire strait. And we got to, it doesn't mean you do open door for every technology, but we're sending them black programs. But we've got to be able to streamline that bureaucratic process so that we can share some of our technology with them as they're developing theirs to actually have a synergistic effect. Secondly, I think it's critical to solve the ammunition deal. And it's like everybody's sort of obvious, but there got to be some creative ways. One of which is our own services are being a bit jealous with their assets. So they're sitting on, so I'd say, well, gee, if we had, we have a war in Europe, we have a war in the Pacific, we need so much war reserve stocks, therefore we can't give any more. And I think that's a mistake. And when we talk about a need for an American strategy, we need to say, wait a minute, if this is really a critical conflict.
That's a political decision. I'm talking about a procedural thing where we have a rule change so that these things can go fast.
I won't argue with it, but the part of that is part. I will not. Part of it is a procedural issue in the sense of getting stuff done. But about the policy. Lastly, I think the 5 countries that I mentioned are creating these strategic partnerships. I think the United States ought to approach that and do so carefully, and particularly giving some aid and support for this MITS initiative. This is a Ukrainian initiative at the cabinet level, and it could make a big difference in jump-starting these. But it is a procedural thing about, well, gee, they're too small. I think we need to recognize the value of these entrepreneurial companies and find ways to help them and not kind of just push them off to the side, which I think we do. Right?
Yeah. Just very quickly, I've been involved with some Ukrainian companies on some efforts to modernize some Russian kit, but using American hardware in the process. You have no idea how hard that is. You have no idea how many times I was called an enemy of the people because I was just trying to be helpful. I mean, and then once this thing gets started, the Ukrainian company comes to me and they say, well, these idiot American companies couldn't figure out how to give me a contract. I said, well, yeah, but he said, well, he says, you know, they give me a bunch of money and I go to my bank and because they have money laundering laws in Ukraine, my bank can't accept the money because I don't have a contract to show where I got it from. I mean, there's the mechanism that should have been there a year ago to facilitate this sort of thing still doesn't exist.
About procedures, and we should divide it in 3 parts. First of all, it's decision making. So to get the permission, it's the longest part of the process. It's about licensing. It's about other things, discussions here in or European Command. Once there is a decision, the process is very fast. If especially these items are available, if they are someday in stock, no problem. U.S. Army works like a tough mechanism. There is a problem with preparing the equipment which was in storages and requires some services before to be delivered. And that is the issue because there is no adrenaline in the logistic people here because they live on the peacetime tempo. In Ukraine, we could do it much faster because we understand the feeling in the front. So if we could fix that stage to prepare the equipment which need to be delivered in a more fast manner, it would be very helpful. About delivery of already existing ready equipment, it's not the problem. US machine is one of the best in the world, so we receive it immediately. If anybody was in Poland, in Rzeszów, there's a huge logistic base where all equipment from all countries of the world for Ukraine arrive. And every 10, 15 minutes, you see the huge American cargo plane carrying something, if there is a decision to give it to Ukraine. So, and both sides, if they sit together, Ukrainian and American side, and they agreed on the dates and volumes, usually it is executed. The problem is, as I mentioned, with the decision-making about the permission and the servicing of the equipment, which is somewhere in the storage. All other things, yes, there are some custom issues, other issues. They were much more worse at the beginning of the war. Now, step by step, they are simplified where possible. It's not the key problem. And we also discussed today, for example, here with the government, about losing the procedures of US companies' presence in Ukraine. Now it's forbidden. So, and also how to easy procedure of providing licenses for technological transfer, for direct commercial sales, like that. So there is a number of initiatives, and it's much better than we started the war.
We're going to start taking two questions at a time. Walter has the first, and sir, you'll be the second.
I'm just very,
Wait to the mic, Walter.
I'm just very curious. Once you mentioned the Hamas issue and the fact that the Red Sea has become a real sort of zone of its own, and we know that sooner or later someone's going to be playing around with sea drones on the bad side and seriously doing it. Isn't it imperative for the Americans? And this is actually to defend both General Hodges and the entire panel. We've been talking about it. Isn't that another imperative why in this particular panel we should be really interested in cooperation between Ukrainian industry and U.S. industry? Because the fact is, we have a lot to learn about those sea babies and how they, because the United States has got a lot of carriers around, and the Chinese are watching as well. So isn't it imperative at this point, man, that someone sit down in Washington and decide that maybe we've got a lot to learn from these crazy ukes and that are sinking, just sank 1/3 of the Black Sea fleet? Or am I losing it? I mean,
Why would you pay the Ukrainians $30,000 for one of these things when you can pay Raytheon 1.1 million?
Well, that's what I was going to also ask you that.
Okay, I mean, it's that Ukrainian model is not built to tolerances out in the 16th decimal place. That's just not acceptable.
We're in the 23rd congressional district.
Yeah, and just to actually follow that up, because the Chinese now are trying to outdo, despite the fact that they're seeing that capital ships might be in trouble, they're building a whole lot of capital ships. Wouldn't it be in our interest to go asymmetric on them and build sea drones?
Well, yes. So you had the second question.
I was wondering.
Can you identify yourself?
Oh yeah, sorry. Grant Turner, currently with Yorktown Institute. I was wondering how much, when it comes to the competition amongst all these companies, it's open source and sharing, or if they're kind of siloing and keeping their information to themselves. So yeah, in other words, is this ecosystem of companies really working together, or are they competing kind of more aggressively against each other?
Are those Ukrainian companies you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. I can tell you that on some of these programs, I'll just use the Neptune as an example. And of course, this happened before the war, but there was very, very good cooperation between the major partners. But I will say that these were companies that basically already knew each other pretty well. They worked together on other things. Personally, the enterprise directors knew each other. So, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but yeah, there is cooperation in some. There could always be more, but it's not non-existent.
That's why these entrepreneurial countries need some mentorship, people who can help make that synapse.
And maybe to add to this, so we have a kind of ecosystem of these companies in Ukraine, and they have a number of joint events, how to share the designs, how to share the ideas, and our government is involved in that. So we call that events hackathons. And we can see it's a closed event for companies only, but there are a lot of young companies with a small number of people, but with great ideas. And together they discuss time to time that ideas because of the war. It's not about the competition, it's about how to achieve the effective design as soon as possible. After the war, they will become tough competitors, of course, and not many survive.
Let me add a point to Walter's question. We'll come to you, sir. It was revealed a couple of days ago in the press that we have telephone intercepts from the Russians to the Houthis. So when the Houthis got up and said that the next target is going to be cable traffic in the Red Sea between Europe and Asia, which is a vital target, that's a Russian operation. I mean, General Hodges knows from his experience, others who've been in NATO, NATO worries a lot about the Russian fleet trying to interdict those communications between the continental US and Europe. when the war started in February 22, people don't realize this, the Northern Fleet surged out of its Arctic bases into the North Atlantic to be prepared to cut those communications if we retaliated. If you remember, there's this whole scandal about them interfering with Irish fishermen, and that's what this was all about. So this is a Russian operation, and they were happy we got from the Russian, and it would not be surprising to see Russian drones or missiles coming from Russia, or Iranian missiles subcontracted from Iran and so on, or even from the factory that they built in Russia to the Houthis to do this, to create a second front, essentially, and tie us down. Again, you know, Ukraine is exerting itself to its utmost. People have to learn from that example and understand that the Russians are going to try to widen the front. What's going on in the Balkans is another example. Transnistria and Moldova was mentioned today. And a third, so this is, I think, a deliberate strategy by Moscow to harass the alliance wherever possible globally. And there's going to have to be technological solutions to this, because as somebody pointed out earlier today, we cannot be on the wrong side of the cost equation. If you can build a drone for $100,000 and it can do damages in the millions, and the only way you can take that out is a missile costing 10 million, that's not going to work.
There's also the speed.
Right.
We're operating as if we have all the time in the world, and we don't. And in terms of our own resupplying, our building up our own ammunition stocks, and so forth. One way to look at it is Ukraine is buying us time, buying us and NATO time, particularly the Europeans. They're tying up 14 of the 14 Russian armies today. When that conflict stops, however it ceases, and the Russians redeploy those, and they've already said a couple are going up against Finland, a couple more are going against the Baltics, and then into Belarus. It's going to dramatically change the threat. And so whatever time that takes the Russians to end the conflict and redeploy the stuff, that's time NATO has to get ready. But it's not infinite, and we need to take it much more serious. That time is not on our side.